So this week we'll be focusing on election campaigns. They're a very important way in which an important element of our culture, but also a time in which disparate parties are trying very, very hard to convince us that their perspectives are correct. And next week we'll look at the idea of post-truth and the different ways that arguments and what is sort of acceptable and not acceptable in the form of truth is explored. So let me get started. So going back once again to our first couple of weeks where we looked at representation and the idea of discourse, you'll see this quote. Well, you won't if it's not on your screen. See this quote: "The media's role is never solely confined to imparting information, but necessarily involves arbitrating between the discursive frameworks of rival groups." Now, what is meant by this quote is straightforward. The idea that nothing arrives at you in a vacuum. So when you were reading Stuart Hall talking about the idea that there's all sorts of influences and all sorts of cultural meanings we attach to even something as simple as a visual image or a word. You can think when you're trying to describe something as complex as how to run a country and politics and different ideas about what's important and what's not important, there's a whole lot of potential for the media to play a role in shaping what we find out. Because most of us are not, having conversations directly with Malcolm Turnbull or whoever the case may be. So we rely very much on the media to give us the information about what's going on and potentially let us know what is true and what is not true when we may not be able to make those judgments for ourselves because we might not have enough information. So when we talk about the discursive frameworks of rival groups, so these are sort of frameworks of discourse, of how they think, how they talk about it. Obviously, if you have Labour and Liberal, for example, they match on some in some discursive frameworks. It's important to have a strong economy and jobs and these sorts of things, and they might not match on other criteria of what is important and what is not important. So the idea is a discursive framework is not necessarily unique to someone, but it sets up how you think about, how you process, and how you put things forward into the public consciousness. So as I was saying, could have to do with what is good or bad, what is important and what is unimportant. These discourses, of course, reflect certain assumptions, but they also, as we looked at in terms of discourse earlier, they also help create certain assumptions because they're constantly repeating these ideas of what is important, how does this work, these sorts of things. So, for example, we have a two-party political system, and I think it's quite easy for us to think of the fact that, that's just how democracy works. But there are democracies, for example, Germany and places in Scandinavia, that have a lot more parties that have to work together to run things. So it isn't necessarily the only way it is, but it's a sort of an assumed thing that we have, that's what democracy is, because it's what we're used to and what has been reinforced to us over and over again. So there's such things as a focus on perception and what the public think is an important part of the discursive framework. We read a lot about where are they in the polls and this sort of thing. That very much indicates this strong focus on perception and on selling a candidate, even when it's not in a direct election cycle, though we're going to focus this week on the election cycle. And even the discursive framework of voters being cynical or apathetic is part of this discourse, whether it's part of the party's discourse of trying to energise voters or get them out to vote. It also having these particular kinds of discursive frameworks and this idea of a battle of them all the time can make people very tired of it, very apathetic, and not really necessarily wanting to engage because they don't feel like anything will happen. So that in itself is another discursive framework, that what's the point? Nothing's going to happen. So what you see on your screen in front of you is the respective platforms of the Liberal National Party and also Labor on the right-hand side, and these are from their websites. So what I'd like us to do is have a bit of a look through this and think about what is the discursive framework that is set up by these platforms, i.e. what assumptions are made, what is being considered as valuable or not valuable, and how is that framed or set up. So you'll notice some things are the same, some of the things are not. So a strong new economy and a strong economy for all Australians are both coming in there. Discursively saying for all Australians says that they want an economy that is of benefit to everybody, and that, I guess, is then an emphasis and a way of differentiating themselves from the idea of it just being a strong economy that might benefit particular kinds of people. Some of them are quite different. So new opportunities for an ageing Australia, for example, which makes it into Labor's platform, is not at all apparent in the Coalition's platform. And something like communications, which is in the Coalition's platform, doesn't appear in Labor's. So partly this is just the fact that, different things are important to these different groups. But it reaffirms, reaffirms the battlegrounds on which they're going to compete and which the media is then going to highlight their competition. So the fact that they're comparable in some ways, but in other ways they set themselves up in quite distinct ways. So a health system for all versus world-class health care. Obviously, say both wanting healthcare, but as a different spin, shall we say, being put on each example. So there you have a situation where they're not just setting up what they want to happen in this election cycle, but also drawing on, Labor's historical association with the working class, for example. So that idea that the discourse isn't coming from nowhere, it's being built up over time, and its ability to make a stand really depends on that, though, as we'll talk about next week. These things can come a little bit from nowhere. So if we think about these platforms, it's also useful to think about how does the media go about how are the political parties using the media to transmit these messages? Unless you're reading the pamphlets that you get in your mailbox and the sort of direct advertising, you're not necessarily always getting, you're not necessarily going to be getting the messages that various political parties want to put out. They need to be able to contact you through sort of third party media in order to engage people and get people listening to their messages. So the term spin you might be familiar with. This is the term used to refer to strategic political communication. And according to Kara and Lowe, strategic political communication involves 5 sets of players, politicians who act as media performers, and in the next video I'll talk to you in more detail about that. The spin industry, who manage impressions. We won't go as deeply into that, but there will be some discussion of that in the final video about datification. media workers like journalists, presenters, hosts and researchers, media audiences, so us, and policymakers who remain deliberately backstage, shielded from as much scrutiny as possible. So this is, as I was saying, because this is the main way we get information about what is going on in a sort of a macro context that is going to affect our lives, potentially, some things more than others. But, you know, Medicare and all these sorts of things are very relevant to us, but we are not necessarily in any kind of control or place of influence. So we rely on the media to give us these messages and to let us know what is going on and if there is something going on. This is the term used is the idea of the fourth estate, and quite a few of you I know are doing communications, so you will have come across this already. But this posits the importance within a democracy of the media, that it's not just entertainment, that there is a really important role to be played, a sort of a watchdog role, you could say, keeping an eye on what's going on behalf of the citizens of any given country, and thus enabling them to intervene if they need to intervene. So obviously this is really important. Certain scholars have argued that this is undermined by unequal access to the media, or unequal access to being part of the media. So that the fact that the media is still quite dominated by quite elite players, very big corporations. They're more likely, if you look into the research on it, they're much more likely to interview people of high status and not necessarily the person in the street to find out what's going on, what their views are, and so forth. So the idea is that there are still these sorts of limitations that we saw way back, as in that video you saw. So the structure of how the media works, of course, also plays a role in shaping this. So essentially, you want some drama in what you see, particularly in this age where people are getting lots of their news online, and it relies on you clicking on a particular headline. The most dramatic headline will generally get the most clicks. So the structure of the media is that it's usually almost always commercial, except for some small exceptions like the ABC and so forth. So it relies on advertising, so it relies on number of clicks or views or reads or papers sold. And thus, it does need to do certain things to keep its audience interested, and to perhaps pump up the drama from time to time if they need to. So if you think about it in this respect, getting attention, a political party getting attention from the mass media is more likely to get that if on issues where the two sides are pitched in a sort of ideological battle. So whether, you know, over a particular issue, usually a very controversial issue, you can get lots of sound bites of politicians insulting each other back and forth, in a way that lots of issues where they do agree and do actually, you know, vote on the same thing and kind of get on with governing the country, you're not going to see that going on. So the issues as they are told to us in the media are to some extent shaped by that demand. And I think, you know, as audiences, we're probably suspect in that as well, because we do tend to want to see, we want to see something new, we want to see something interesting, and so forth. So there is that role of trying to give it some drama. So I'm going to leave that there. Thank you for watching.